Hello everyone. This is our third lecture in the biogeochemistry section of Fundamentals of Ecology. We've done an introduction to biogeochemistry and systems ecology, and we've talked about the nitrogen cycle, and now I'm going to talk to you about the phosphorus cycle, and I'm going to try to contrast differences and show you differences between the phosphorus cycle and the nitrogen cycle. To understand the phosphorus cycle, you really need to have a strong understanding of soil chemistry. So you've spent 2 weeks with Bob learning about soil chemistry and soil physics. So this should all be a refresher for you. However, I'm going to go through it in a little bit of detail so that you're on top of all of these concepts and terms, and that'll make your understanding of the phosphorus cycle a lot easier. We need to know about the soil chemistry because the phosphorus comes from the soil and it has no gas phase. So all of the key processes related to phosphorus are all about soil chemistry. You can think about this figure as a systems diagram for soil chemistry. The blue boxes are pools or stocks, and all the arrows are different processes that cause elements to move from one stock to another. So all the arrows are fluxes. We start with primary minerals, i.e. rocks, and through weathering, some of these minerals become broken down and dissolved in the soil solution, where they exist as charged ions. You will remember that these charged ions can become adsorbed onto clay and humus in the soil, which is one of the main processes that stops them from being lost to the system through leaching. However, they can also be desorbed back into the soil solution. So we have one flux from the soil solution towards soil colloids, exchange surfaces like clays, and the ions can get adsorbed or desorbed back into the soil solution. Now, some of these ions can also precipitate out into insoluble forms, which means they are no longer in the soil solution and no longer available for uptake by plants. So we have another flux from the soil solution into insoluble forms, and then you can also go the other way. These insoluble forms can dissolve back into the soil solution. And finally, there are the fluxes associated with plant uptake and microbial immobilization. Now, immobilization is really just another word for uptake. It's basically the process. In this process, inorganic minerals are converted to an organic form inside the plant or the microbe. So this process of uptake or immobilization is taking inorganic minerals and making them organic. Then we have all of the cycling that we had when we talked about the nitrogen cycle. The organic material decomposes into organic matter, and then with the help of microbes, it is mineralized back into an inorganic form in the soil solution. So you need to make sure that at this stage of the course you understand all of these processes, you know what all of these words mean, and you have a sense of the cycling of elements inside the soil solution. Now I'm going to talk specifically about phosphorus. Like nitrogen, phosphorus is also really important for life because it is part of adenosine triphosphate. Plants and animals don't need as much phosphorus as they need nitrogen, so they have very different element ratios or stoichiometry. But even though they only need a little bit, if they don't have it, then they can't function. So phosphorus is often the key factor limiting how productive different ecosystems are around the world. We are going to think about phosphorus in a similar way to nitrogen. We're going to talk about the inputs, we're going to talk about the outputs, and we're going to talk about within ecosystem cycling. Fortunately, the phosphorus cycle is a lot simpler than the nitrogen cycle, largely because there's no gaseous form of phosphorus. Inputs to the ecosystem therefore come primarily through weathering of rock. The rock weathers and the phosphorus within it can dissolve into the soil solution. Once this rock has weathered, however, some phosphorus can be blown around the globe and deposited in other places as dust. This is important because some geological material is naturally low in phosphorus, so the phosphorus in some ecosystems needs to come from elsewhere, and the only place it can come from is from dust moving around the globe. It's also true that the ocean is very extremely phosphorus limited because all the phosphorus in the ocean has to come from dust being blown off the land and into the ocean. and that happens in different parts of the ocean. And a lot of the fertilization in the Atlantic Ocean comes from dust that's blown from Africa into the Atlantic Ocean. It's a very important driver of the marine cycles and phosphorus cycle. We saw this table in the previous lecture when we were talking about nitrogen. As you see, phosphorus is also cycled tightly within the plant. It is actually even more conserved than nitrogen. Remember when we mentioned that you need adenosine triphosphate to get biological nitrogen fixation. You need energy to fix nitrogen. And in terms of biology, in order to use energy, you need ATP. So this means that often the availability of nitrogen ultimately depends on the availability of phosphorus, because plants and microbes can only fix nitrogen when they have phosphorus, which enables the energy requirements of biological nitrogen fixation. So let's have a look at this table again. If you remember the word translocation, that means the withdrawal of nutrients from senescing leaves and subsequent storage within the plant. And this is the same table we showed you before. We had leaves before senescence, so green, healthy leaves. And you can see there's about 0.56 grams per meter squared of phosphorus in a leaf in this forest before senescence. After senescence, when the leaf has gone all brown and dry and has dropped from the tree, there's only 0.21 grams per meter squared of phosphorus. And a little bit of that phosphorus got leached while the leaf was senescing. So the ultimate amount that got taken back by the plant before it dropped the leaf was 0.34 grams per meter squared. So that meant 61% of the phosphorus in the leaf was taken back by the plant before the plant dropped the leaf. And if you remember from the nitrogen lecture, it was only 50% of the nitrogen. So phosphorus is even more conserved than nitrogen. And there's a lot of very tight within plant cycling. Okay, so I've demonstrated to you that plants really hold on to phosphorus if they can, which is an indication that phosphorus is a very limiting nutrient. So let's start to think about why phosphorus is limiting to plants. Firstly, it's often strongly adsorbed by soil colloids. This doesn't mean it's impossible for plants to get hold of, but it does mean that they need to go and fetch it. They can't just take up water and assume that there will be phosphorus in the soil solution available for them to take up. So plants need a lot of root hairs to explore the soil volume. And they also make use of mycorrhizae for this. So this picture that you see here is an example of all the different forms that phosphorus can be in the soil, indicating how available it is to the plant. So the phosphate ions that are in solution are immediately available to the plant. When the plant takes up water, it's taking up the phosphorus. But there isn't a lot of phosphorus in the soil solution because a lot of the phosphorus is adsorbed onto the soil colloids. It's readily extractable, but the plant has to go and find that phosphorus and take it off the soil colloids, so it needs to grow roots that can go explore the soil volume. Then there's also a lot of phosphorus that is strongly bonded or adsorbed. So that is quite hard for the plants to get hold of. And then some of the phosphorus has actually precipitated out in insoluble forms, and that is very hard for the plants to get hold of. So phosphate ions can float around in the soil solution, but they also very readily adsorb onto soil particles, or else they combine with elements in the soil like calcium, magnesium, aluminium, and iron. And when they've combined with those elements, they've precipitated out. They're now solid, and they're hard for the plants to extract. So a lot of the phosphorus that's in the soil is actually unavailable to plants. However, you have to remember that the strong adsorption of phosphorus is also a good thing, because it means the phosphorus is not leached from the soil as readily as nitrogen is. So we know that the phosphorus in the soil can be in various different forms, and that some of these forms are more available to plants than others. I'm now going to demonstrate to you that the pH of the soil is very important control affecting which form the phosphorus is in. This diagram quantifies the proportion of all phosphorus in the soil that is in different forms, depending on the pH. So on the y-axis, you have the proportion of phosphorus and on the x-axis you have the pH. You can see that in acid soils with a very low pH, most of the P, almost 70% of the phosphorus, is bonded to iron, magnesium, and aluminium, and that means it's not very available to plants. On the other hand, in basic soils, pH is above 7, most of the phosphorus is bonded to calcium. It's only rarely around a pH of 6 or 7 that there is a significant amount of available phosphorus in the system. So you see the small little amount at the bottom of available phosphorus increases, and it's maximized at a pH of around 6 or 7, but it never gets higher than about 20%. So usually about 80%, at least 80% of the phosphorus in the soil is not easy for the plants to extract. What does this mean? This means that if you're a farmer and you want to fertilize your plants with phosphorus, then you first have to make sure the pH of your soil is correct. Otherwise, it will just immediately become unavailable. You can pour phosphorus on your system and the phosphorus will bind to iron, magnesium, and aluminium, and the plant still won't be able to take it up. So maintaining a soil pH between 6 and 7 will result in the most efficient use of phosphate. The last few slides should have demonstrated to you why phosphorus is hard to get hold of and why phosphorus is often limiting. And this means that plants really need help to get hold of the phosphorus that is available in the soil. And they get this help from a symbiotic relationship with fungus, mycorrhizae. This picture shows a root hair. The root hair is the big fat object in the middle of the picture. It's actually incredibly tiny, but it's not as tiny as the strands of mycorrhizal hyphae that surround the root hair. So all of the thin strands are hyphae from a mycorrhizae, a fungus. You can see easily that the amount of space or the soil volume that the plant root can explore has been increased a lot by having the mycorrhizae. If it wasn't for the mycorrhizae, that root tip would only be able to explore a very small amount of the space. The more soil space the plant can explore, the more it can find the small amount of available phosphorus in the soil and take it up before another plant does. So this slide is just to summarize what I've been telling you. The uptake of phosphorus is facilitated by symbiotic associations. You should all know what a symbiosis is by now. And this is a mycorrhizal fungal hyphae network associated with the roots. The phosphorus is usually taken up as phosphate, PO4 3-. The fungi send millions of tiny root threads from the plant roots. These hyphae separate the clay particles and allow essential air and water into the root zone, or else they bind together a sandy soil to form a moisture-holding biomass. So they do all sorts of exciting things. As well as exploring the soil volume, they alter and they break apart the clay platelets. Around 80 to 90% of plants actually have mycorrhizal associations, but different plants are associated with different communities of fungus. It had probably evolved with land plants. So the moment you had plants on land, they started to form these associations with mycorrhizae to help them to explore the soil, to help them to break the soil apart, and to help them to access the important nutrients they need to get from the soil. So around 460 million years ago, we think that we can find fossil plants that had mycorrhizal associations. There are two main types of mycorrhizae. You can see from this figure that the difference between them is how they interact with the cells inside the plant roots. Ectomycorrhizae are fungal hyphae that surround the root tips and develop between the epidermal cells, but they never actually enter the cell lumen. On the other hand, you also get arbuscular mycorrhiza. And in these, the hyphae reach the root inner cortex and develop highly branched, estranged structures called arbuscules inside the cells. So far, we have talked about inputs to the terrestrial phosphorus cycle, and we've talked about within ecosystem cycling of phosphorus. Now we need to think about outputs of phosphorus from the ecosystem. Again, the phosphorus cycle is less leaky than the nitrogen cycle. There are 3 fluxes out: leaching, erosion, and harvest. Leaching occurs in the same way as nitrogen, when you've got the phosphate ions and you've got dissolved organic phosphorus in the soil solution, and then water runs through the soil and out into the groundwater or the streams, then it's leached from the system. Erosion happens via wind or water. So if you have runoff, running off and taking dust and soil off the surface into the ocean or into the rivers, then that's a way of that phosphorus is lost. Also, in many of our drier systems, you have dust storms where the dust particles are lifted up and blown away. And I mentioned that as a way that phosphorus gets input into other ecosystems. But if it's an input to the marine ecosystem, it must be an output from the terrestrial ecosystem. So erosion is an ecosystem output. And finally, you have harvest. In agricultural systems, every time we harvest something in a field and take it away to be eaten, then we're taking phosphorus from the system, from the ecosystem. So as you would expect, because phosphorus is so limiting, people have also tried to find ways to increase the inputs to the system, just as they tried with nitrogen. If you remember with nitrogen, one of the key ways people have found to increase the nitrogen inputs is through artificial nitrogen fixation, the Haber-Bosch process. And they did that to increase agricultural productivity. But there's no point in fertilizing with nitrogen if you don't have enough phosphorus, because you still won't increase productivity. So people have looked at ways to fertilize with phosphorus. However, the only way to do this is to artificially increase the weathering process. So the way we create phosphorus fertilizer is that we mine phosphate-rich rock, we grind it up, and we add it to our agricultural fields all over the world. So just like with nitrogen, we have been dramatically increasing the phosphorus inputs to all of our agricultural systems. This is a graph from the US Geological Survey showing the increase. That's tons of phosphorus that have been added globally since the 1900s to about 2015. And you can see a dramatic increase in the amount of phosphate rock production. So this has helped us increase our productivity and feed the almost 8 billion people in the world. But just like with nitrogen, this phosphate fertilization can cause problems. I think you probably learned about eutrophication in your lectures with Dara. When we add a lot of phosphorus to ecosystems that usually were quite closed, so usually the phosphorus cycle tightly within the ecosystem, then they start to become leaky, and the phosphorus leaches out into other ecosystems where it causes problems. This graph shows the concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus in the water in streams that run from ecosystems that are natural versus agricultural. So the left-hand graph is the nitrogen concentration, the right-hand graph is the phosphorus concentration. And they're recording the amount of inorganic and the amount of organic nitrogen and phosphorus. On the y-axis, they've classified the ecosystem in terms of how natural it is. At the top, you've got almost 90% natural ecosystem, and then it goes down to become more of a rangeland, starts to have 50% agriculture, and the very bottom bar is an ecosystem that has more than 90% agriculture. So the amount of nitrogen in the streams and the amount of phosphorus in the streams increases dramatically as you increase the amount of agriculture in a system. And both the inorganic and the organic phosphorus and nitrogen increase, but it's mostly it's both the organic and the inorganic that increase. So you end up with a whole lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in the streams and the rivers and the lakes and the oceans that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And when added in large amounts as a fertilizer, phosphorus leaching can be very problematic. This map shows the extent and the intensity of the dead zone that you find. This is in the southern tip of the US, just near Texas and Louisiana. And to understand what caused this dead zone, we have to understand that aquatic systems are usually very limited by phosphorus. Remember, I told you that in aquatic systems, the phosphorus has to come in through leaching or dust. So what happened here is that all the agriculture in Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi increased the amount of phosphorus in the rivers in the southern United States, and that phosphorus went out of the rivers and then into the ocean. and all the phosphorus that went into the marine system caused eutrophication. And the result of that was a system that used to be limited by nitrogen, by phosphorus, now had a huge amount of phosphorus, and there was an excessive bloom of phytoplankton. All the plant material in the ocean suddenly grows a lot more than it usually would. You have huge production. And in order for plants to grow, they need oxygen. So all the dissolved oxygen gets used up, and it becomes a very harmful environment for other organisms. This map actually shows the oxygen levels in different parts of this basin, and it can go down to really low levels where all the fish die. You can see in this figure which the countries are that have been irresponsibly using too much phosphorus fertilizer. It's very clear which parts of the world have been adding so much phosphorus to their agricultural system that the ecosystems have become leaky and have ended up with too much phosphorus in the river systems and in the marine systems. However, as we have learned in this lecture, there are other ways to increase your phosphorus supply to soils. You can make the phosphorus that is there more readily available to plants by balancing the pH and by encouraging healthy mycorrhizal associations. Therefore, there's a move towards more sustainable forms of fertilization that try to manage the existing phosphorus cycle to the benefit of plant growth, rather than just disturbing it by massively increasing the inputs. Here is a summary of the phosphorus cycle. I like this systems diagram because it identifies all the stocks and the fluxes, but it also shows the inputs, the outputs, and the within system cycling. So the green colors are all processes that happen within the ecosystem. The blue is all the inputs, and the orange is all the outputs, the loss from the soil. Have a look at this diagram, make sure you understand all the processes involved. Make sure you also understand how to read a systems diagram, how to think about stocks and fluxes and cycling of elements. So that's a brief summary of understanding the introduction to the phosphorus cycle. By the end of this lecture, these are the things that you need to be able to do. You need to be able to describe where phosphorus comes from, and you also need to explain why it is limiting. You also need to explain how phosphorus availability depends on pH. So those are the two quite complicated slides that I showed you. You need to be able to talk about the different forms of phosphorus in the soil and how some of those forms are more available and less available to plants. And then you have to link that to pH by explaining how those different forms are linked to the pH. So phosphorus binds with iron and magnesium and aluminium when it's an acid soil, and it binds with calcium when it's a basic soil. You also need to describe ways that plants have evolved to increase their ability to take up phosphorus. You need to be able to explain how humans have altered the inputs and the outputs of the phosphorus in ecosystems, and you need to discuss the consequences of this. You also, now that you've learned about the phosphorus and the nitrogen cycle, you need to be able to contrast the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycles. So if I was with you in class now, I would make a class exercise where you all get up on the board and compare the inputs and the outputs and the fluxes of the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycles. And I suggest you try do that at home. So you take a piece of paper and you put nitrogen on one side and phosphorus on the other, and you list the inputs to the nitrogen cycle, the inputs to the phosphorus cycle, the outputs to the nitrogen cycle, and the outputs to the phosphorus cycle. And then when it comes to cycling within the ecosystem, you also try to contrast the different fluxes and the different constraints of the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. And if you can do that, then I think you'll have understood and you'll be prepared well for understanding the exam, and you'll be able to move forward as an ecologist.